to balance out spreading across campus. So last year we had communication studies and biology. This year we had history, and now we have another professor of biology, associate dean and professor of biology, Creagh Breuner.
Thanks, you guys. And we can just do that because I don't need it. So you guys have been listening to a lot of people sitting down behind microphones, and I don't do that very well. So I'm going to be here. And I have like 3 things I want to go over when you're thinking about teaching. But first, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. So I'm in biology, came in as a professor in biology and wildlife biology, and I'm now a full professor and stepped up as associate dean, head of biology. So I'm doing a lot more administration. And the sad part about that is that I don't teach right now. But one of the things that I have done is teach classes to graduate students on how to teach. And there are orientations and things to help you as a TA, but it's hard to learn how to put a whole class together as a professor, and you really don't get training for that much. And so over the last 8 years, 6 to 8 years, I've done 2 for STEM, and I'm hoping to bring those back in at some point. But it's I think a lot about how to reach students. I think a lot about how, when you're in front of the classroom, if you can get the students to care about what you're talking about, they're going to retain so much more of it. So before I go into my 3 things, I guess the first thing I want to point out about teaching, because some of you are here to teach, but a lot of you are teaching because it's how you're going to pay your bills. It's how you're going to make money so that you can do the studies that you want to do. My experience is that the studies that you want to do have very little positive feedback in them. Graduate school is hard, and you set yourself to a task and you work on it. And in science, you do experiments, and maybe a year and a half later you get a paper out of it. So one of the things I love about teaching, and I loved about TAing when I was at this stage, was that there's positive feedback involved. On a daily basis, when you can get students to understand things because you're easier to approach to them, and you've been in the class and maybe seen what the professor's saying with a huge number of students, you're talking to many fewer, you can help them understand what the professor is talking about or what you need to teach them in a much clearer way. And I'm going to recommend you celebrate those positive feedbacks, because you don't get those in graduate school itself. So if you can, putting energy into it, yeah, you have to limit your time. Teaching can take up all of your time. You will get better at it and figure out how to limit your time in it. But putting energy and time into it means that you turn on light bulbs. And it's such a stereotype, but it's one of the coolest things, is when you're in a classroom and you can reach the students and have them want to learn more from you, have them change what they're thinking about what they think is interesting. So hang on to that as the fact that you're not here to teach, you're here to study and do your graduate work, but it is a benefit that can go well. Okay, so the 3 things I thought of that I would pass along, and they're just, the 3 titles of it. One is engage, and I'll talk about that. The second is be honest, and I'll talk about that. And the third is be aware. I'll talk about that. So engage, there's a big movement in teaching that some of you may have experienced already, this active and collaborative learning. When you stand up in front of a group of students and you talk at them like I am doing now, which is a little lame, but I only have 15 minutes, it's easy for them to turn off. And there's that phrase of the classroom where the information goes through the mouth of the professor onto the pages of the students without ever passing through the mind of either. And you want to avoid that. So one of the things that I talk to people about is when you're giving information, if you have, where you have a 20-minute mini lecture or you have an hour-long discussion that you need to lead, if you have to transfer a bunch of information, put questions into it. If you've got notes for the lecture you're going to give, For every hour, 50 minutes of lecture, I tell people, put in 3 questions where you will stop and say to them, so how does this fit in? And when you start doing it, they're gonna hate it. But as you do it more, they start to realize it's safe to answer. And they start to realize that if they're thinking while you're talking, they'll be able to answer. That if they have to process to do that. One of the things I do in my classes when I teach is that I have, and I tell them all at the beginning of the semester, I randomly call on someone at the beginning of each class period and ask them to summarize the last class. And they hate it. And then at the end of the semester in the comments, they say, but you know, it made me go over my notes from the last class, and it helped us figure out what we hadn't understood, and it gave continuity between lectures. So that's one example, but put questions. When you're imparting information, don't just stand up here and talk like this. Ask them questions. So engaging students, the first thing, is a way to get them invested in the material that you're teaching them. It's also a way to get out questions where they might not understand what you're saying. The second thing is pretty simple, be honest. And what I mean by that is when you first get up in front of students, and maybe for a while after that, you're gonna feel like you should know everything and that you should have answers to all of their questions. And you're not going to. I teach an endocrinology class where I teach senior pre-med, pre-health students about how the endocrine system works. And you know, they start asking me about a new type of birth control that I haven't ever heard of. Or they'll start asking me about some medical condition they think they have. You need to be able to say, I don't know, that's a great question. And then you can say, I'll go look it up. Or you say, you go look it up, and let's figure out what the answer is. So if you can not expect yourself to know everything, then you're gonna be in much better shape, because as soon as you start trying to answer when you don't know, they're gonna figure it out. And then your respect goes way down. And so figuring out how to keep that balance of having the information and but then being able to say, yeah, I don't actually, that's a great question and I don't know. So that will serve you well. And the third thing actually sounds like you guys have been talking about it all day, and that's be aware. The thing I tell new graduate students is you are going to have, a number of you are going to have students in your office during office hours that are very close to you in age. So always leave your door open. Whenever you have an undergraduate in there, leave your door open, because it just is a way to be sure that that person can't claim something happened that didn't. It's being aware of how to make sure that you're putting yourself in a position where you're not going to be accused of something that you didn't intend. And it's hard to realize for a lot of new TAs that you can't treat these students the way you have your peers, that you can't interact with them at a level where it's very easy and you could be as casual. And it takes a little while to figure that out, and that's fine. When I was TAing, I had a student come into my office and close the door behind them, talking to me, and I was really uncomfortable by that. And so I just stood up and said, oh, some other grad students might need the office, and I went and opened the door again. You know, don't get into, I don't know if they've talked about, you know, using sources of communication for talking with your graduate students. I've had some TAs that give out their phone numbers, and that can lead to inappropriate things. So I will, you know, I'm not gonna tell you absolutely what the rules are because I don't know them, but I tell people not to. So be aware of what boundaries should be, and that you can't have the level of interaction with them even if they're near your age and you normally would. And like the question over here where, you know, are relationships acceptable? The biggest issue there is that there's a power differential that you as a TA may not realize. That you're used to interacting with people where you can say whatever you want, and of course it's fine. But when there's a power differential, when you have control over their grades, they can't respond in a way they would normally. They are not free to tell you how inappropriate that was because they could feel some pressure back on how it might affect their grades. So my thought is, if something might be happening with someone who's in a class you're TAing, wait until the class is over. Or have them switch sections. But it's a thing where when the power differential is there and you're not aware of it, but they likely are, or at least are feeling some of it. And that's the thing to be careful of. So that was a quick thing. I'm hoping I have enough time to see if you guys have any questions, although I haven't said anything that specific. Except that I want to get back to the fact that TAing can be a very cool thing, that you can get students excited about the topics that you love, and that's positive feedback's amazing. But do you guys have any questions other than that? Yeah. The question was, have I had TAs in my own classes whenever I was teaching? And in about half the classes, because some of my classes are small enough where I don't have a TA. But I have had TAs, yeah. Oh. Yeah, so the question is, have I had boundaries about how much work they should be doing? And I can't remember here, is it 15 or 20 hours a week for a normal TA? And it might differ across departments. I am all about helping my TAs be efficient so that they can get the work done they need to and not have it expand beyond the number of hours they're supposed to be spending. And if they are, then we talk about how can we change what they'd be doing another week so that they have an easier time if they have to get this done now. If that's not possible, how can we change the way they're grading? So I have, I talk to my TAs about when I'm grading exams, and I have written exams, I don't like multiple choice, that there's a way to grade them where you don't have to, you have these checkpoints where you're looking for the different facts they're gonna list. And then you can check them and get through and do a grade on that, instead of trying to think about the intention behind what they said, whether it's right or wrong. There's so much subjective approach to that. So there are different approaches to being more efficient, and those will get easier as you TA the same course or have TA'd longer. But I absolutely think that if it's taking way too much time, you should go to the professor of the class and say, this is taking much more than the X number of hours that I was expecting. Can you help me with tools that I can, ways to be more efficient or ways to share work in different ways that can help me get, do what I need to do. If you approach the professor that way, that could be helpful. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, if you're TAing a class for your peers, that can be fraught, especially if you need to, a dynamic where they will respect the time and the energy and the knowledge that you're spending and the knowledge that you have. I've had graduate students, advanced graduate students, teach courses, and it generally is, I think I would stay even closer to that. Don't ever think that you should know something when you don't, and try to talk about it in that way. It's a good question. I have to think about it a little more. For me, I would say be very clear about your boundaries. That and have if you do a syllabus for for the level of course that you're doing, and if you're doing it yourself, then I would imagine there would be clear in there, because then when something comes up, you can be like, oh yeah, see, it's here. This isn't, this was the policy for the class. You don't have to be pissed at me, it's the policy. Which is a good idea across the board. And if I think of anything else, that's a good question. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, so let me just check. I think I'm okay. Oh, I have a couple minutes too. So one of the things I recommend, I've done a lot of rewriting lecture series. You call them modules, where it's like a 2 to 5 lecture arc. and you put a module together. And one of the things I try to switch between, so we start out the class by me asking them questions. I try to, every other lecture, have a thing where I have my students in groups of 4, and I assign them seating, and they have a folder, and they turn in their work in that folder, and they turn, and they get stuff back in that folder. So I'll pose a question and have them get into pairs and talk about it, or talk about it as that group of 4, and then I'll get opinions from each group, because people are much happier to share an opinion if they're not solely responsible for it. So it makes it much easier to talk back and forth, and for students to feel like they can participate. So asking questions, having continuity across lectures, having small discussion groups within class, you cover less material when you take this approach. So there's the question of breadth versus depth that we could have a whole nother conversation about. Let's see, what other tools? I like to do a thing where I'll have, I teach science classes, so I give students data sets and I ask them to graph them and bring them back in. And then they talk about their graph with their group, so they figure out which graph is the clearest. And then they present that graph to the class, and each group presents a subsequent graph so they can get a full idea about what we're doing. I like to design experiences like that, and I tend to split those up, so in each module there might be something that's that in-depth for one of those 5 classes. But really just starting with stopping and asking a question and waiting for them to answer. And if they don't, call on somebody. And I say, I'm gonna call on you, and if you don't know, say, I don't know. And then I'll call on you about something else, and we'll see if you know that one. Get them used to the fact that that will happen. And then they get much more able to be conversational, even in a class of 80 students. I've done that. Already, I gotta go, but this was fun. and I'll see you on campus. Okay.